So here in the section marked C, we see some of those things. At the bottom of page 14, he mentions the basic rituals of Christian life. So this is sprinkling of water. That's a ritual washing called baptism that means a lot to Christians, and in Locke's day was a cause of a lot of intolerance. People had different ideas about how to do this correctly and what it meant, and it led to terrible fights and even civil wars between people who couldn't settle the question but couldn't leave it alone, wanted the government on their side and couldn't stand the government being on somebody else's side. When you wash people, what does it mean? Is it just a sign that you are going through with the traditional actions of the church, or does it in fact mean that sinning has been taken away? And if it means that sinning has been taken away, what's the right time to do it? Do you do it on little babies so that they are protected by this action as early as possible? Or in light of the importance of sincerity and only doing things you really mean, do you wait till people who are adults before they decide that they themselves want to have this washing and want to have their sins removed? These were serious religious disputes in Locke's day. The use of bread and wine, that is the meal, the symbolic meal that Christians eat from time to time, that's a matter of much dispute along the same lines. Is it a thing that people do to remember Jesus and his last meal on earth when he had those two basic foods? Or is it in fact Jesus? The words that Jesus speaks in the scriptures suggesting that the meal is Jesus himself. Are those in fact the truth? That led to many disputes, and since it couldn't be decided by argument, it was often decided in violence and various intolerant action. It's those kinds of things that Locke is trying to find a solution for, trying to teach people how to behave peaceably about them. So at the bottom of page 14, left-hand column, Locke reminds his audiences of things that would have been familiar to them, the basic things that Christians care about, and therefore the basic things that they fight about. What if instead of bread and wine, which is traditional, you had fish and beer? Would that be something that the government could prevent, because that's the wrong way to do things? And everybody in Locke's Christian nation would understand, no, that's not the right way. That's not the proper meal. But could the government prevent it? Or could some church have the idea that that was the right way when everyone seems to know it's the wrong way? And would the government have nothing to say about that? That's the kind of difficulty that Locke wants us to consider. What if instead of washing people with water, they wash people with animal blood? It sounds not only unhealthy, but also not respectful to God. And if we have this feeling, is it impossible that we could enforce a rule against this? We have a feeling that it's wrong. Is it somehow not permitted in a tolerant society that we should just pass a law that this disgusting practice could not happen, and that we shouldn't do that for the sake of our bodies or for the sake of our relationship to God? What about if someone wanted to sacrifice a dog? And the English are very sentimental about the dogs, treat dogs as members of the family, but on another level also have the idea that the whole world seems to have, that dogs can be somewhat undignified and unclean. It doesn't seem to be the right way to please God to have a ritual killing of a dog. Would we say in a tolerant society that we would just have to allow this and to treat this as ultimately no different from sacrificing a sheep or a lamb, which everyone has the feeling is somehow the right thing to do? I mean, at least many people can recognize that, or have an instinct that that's the right way to honor God. Does toleration mean that in this case, which seems so obvious, we have to pretend that we don't care about the difference? That is the sort of difficulty that Locke wants to pose for us, and that it's up for you to attempt to solve in the discussion forums. Here's a couple of examples, I think, which are even stronger on the last page of the chapter in the section marked D. Top left, what if someone decided to sacrifice a baby as a way to honor God? There have been religions in the world who do just such terrible things, and there are always rumors about this happening. Here again, Locke gives us the marker that he's allowing his imagined opponent to speak. What should we say about this dreadful practice? He's imagining a Christian who remembers that in the early days of Christianity, when it was a religion on the outs and much persecuted, Christians were accused of doing this terrible practice. And the religious person is somewhat shocked that Locke seems to suggest that if Christians did it for real, that toleration would mean that nobody outside whatever misguided church wanted to do this would have anything to say about it. And that just seems false to all our notions of the right way to live and to the morals that would go along with true religion or just being a good human being. Another example would be various sexual practices in the history of religion. It has been known to include sex and sexual things of various kinds. Does toleration really mean that whatever you do in the name of religion is permitted and that the government has nothing to say about it? That just feels wrong to people. And certainly in the case of infant sacrifices, killing babies to honor God, we would say, well, no, that's not just a feeling. That's got to be reasonable. If we don't know that's wrong, what do we know? But Locke's argument for toleration could seem to say, well, no, if you do it in religion, then the government has nothing to say about it, cannot stop it. And that's what tolerance means. But if that's the way Locke's argument goes, then we'd have to say Locke's argument is wrong. Locke picks up a slightly less disturbing example. It's very common for religions of various kinds to include the killing of a calf that is a young cow. And Locke tries to handle this problem by saying, well, the government can't tell you that you cannot kill a calf in order to honor God, because the government never tells you in any circumstances that you cannot kill a calf. This is just what we call farming. People raise cattle, and sometimes they kill the cattle in order to eat them. Governments even think this is good because it provides food for people. And Locke says you simply cannot tell a church not to do this because you don't tell a farmer not to do this. And does this help us figure out what toleration requires, which means that we have to see that things that we reasonably know are good should be permitted, and things that we reasonably know are bad should be prohibited. even when some people want to do the bad things in the name of religion, in the name of honoring God, and for the purpose of finding one's way to saving your soul in the next life. Can we really say that the things we reasonably know are bad cannot be done even with that religious excuse, without violating the principles of toleration? That's the challenge for you in the reading forum. And you should follow along with what Locke says, and I'll just give a review of it without trying to explain it all. I'd like you to struggle with it and explain it to me. He goes so far as to say a government can, in fact, say, you may not kill a cow. Imagine that somehow there's been a disease of the cows and too many of them have died, and the government is afraid that the people will starve over the winter because they don't have enough to eat. They need to keep the few cows they have left in order to rebuild the herd for the future, and then that seems to be a perfectly appropriate thing for government to do. But would we have to say the government can do this, but not if you're killing the cow in order to make a prayer and to honor God? That's the difficulty that Locke is struggling with. And his solution is to say that governments cannot prohibit sacrificing calves, right, which is to say killing for religious purposes. But they can prohibit killing them, as with the example of needing to keep the cow alive for the future of the herd. And that's something for you to test. You could say very reasonably, the word sacrificing includes the notion of killing, so that he's just contradicting himself. He's saying that governments can't prohibit killing, but they can prohibit killing. And he's trying to use two words for the same thing in order to straighten out an argument, which is ultimately tangled up at the bottom. You could say that. So that's the challenge I lay down for you. Can you understand Locke's argument? And does it allow you to say, what's the business of the government? And what's the business of religion? Even though we know that all of these examples, whether you can drink wine, whether you can wash yourself, whether you can kill animals or human beings, all of those are things that both religion and government have strong opinions about. And can we sort it out so that we can rescue the argument in favor of toleration and say very clearly what's permitted to governments and what's permitted to religions? Because that clarity of vision is the strength of his argument, and if we can't have it, then the argument fails.